You know what I never thought about until a few years ago? What happens when your ship takes a cannonball through the hull and the nearest dry dock is 3,000 miles away? I mean, really think about that for a second. You're standing in the belly of a wooden vessel. Ocean water is pouring through a splintered hole the size of a dinner plate. The ship is rolling, your feet are wet, and you've got maybe 20 minutes before the water level becomes a serious problem. There's no hardware store, there's no epoxy, there's no clamp that's going to work on a curved, soaking wet surface while the whole world is pitching side to side. And yet, for over 200 years, sailors and pirates fixed these ships. Not in port, not on land, at sea, in the middle of the Atlantic, sometimes in the middle of a battle. And the methods they came up with are some of the most resourceful woodworking I've ever studied. Today, I'm going to walk you through 5 of those forgotten repair techniques, the ones real ship carpenters used when failure meant sinking. And stick around to the end, because I'll show you a waterproofing trick from the age of sail that I now use in my own shop, and it works better than half the modern products I've tried. Let's get into it. What we're really talking about today is survival woodworking. These aren't fine furniture techniques. These are methods born out of pure desperation and refined over generations by men who had no choice but to make them work. And honestly, the problem solving behind them is something every modern woodworker can learn from, no matter what you build. To understand why these methods are so clever, you need to understand the world these carpenters lived in. During the golden age of piracy, roughly 1680 to 1720, the Caribbean and Atlantic were full of wooden vessels, crewed by men who lived and died by the condition of their ship. Every vessel carried a ship's carpenter, and on pirate ships especially, the carpenter was one of the most valuable crew members on board. He was often the second or third highest paid man after the captain and the quartermaster, and for good reason. If the carpenter couldn't fix what broke, everyone drowned. These ships were built primarily from white oak for the hull planking and frames, with pine or fir for the masts and spars. The hull below the waterline was typically sheathed in thin lead sheets, or later copper to slow marine growth and worm damage. But cannonballs, reef strikes, and general wear could open up the hull at any time. The ship's carpenter had a dedicated workspace down near the bilge, and he kept a chest of tools that was specifically outlined in naval regulations. We'll talk more about that chest later. What strikes me most about studying these men is their philosophy. They didn't have the luxury of perfection. They operated on a principle I'd describe as good enough to survive. A repair didn't have to be pretty. It didn't have to last 10 years. It had to hold until the next port, which might be 3 weeks or 3 months away. And that mindset, that willingness to solve the immediate problem with whatever you have on hand, is something I think a lot of us modern woodworkers could benefit from. We get so caught up in perfection that we forget the craft is really about solving problems. Now, let me walk you through the first method, and it's the one these carpenters used more than any other. When a cannonball punched through the hull below the waterline, the carpenter had to work fast. The standard emergency patch started with oakum, which is old rope fiber pulled apart and saturated with pine tar or Stockholm tar. The carpenter would take handfuls of this tarred oakum and drive it into the hole and the splintered wood around it using a caulking iron and a mallet. He's working in ankle-deep water at this point, sometimes chest-deep, with men on the pumps trying to keep up. Once the oakum was packed tight enough to slow the flow, he'd take a piece of lead sheeting, typically about 1/16 of an inch thick, and nail it over the damaged area using short, broad-headed tacks driven into the surrounding hull planking. The lead was soft enough to conform to the curve of the hull, which is critical because these aren't flat surfaces. The inside of a ship's hull is a complex compound curve. A rigid patch would leave gaps. Lead follows the shape and seals against the oakum underneath. Here's what impressed me about this method. The oakum swells when it gets wet, so the very thing that's causing the problem, the seawater, is actually helping the repair tighten up. The pine tar in the oakum is hydrophobic, so it resists water penetration, while the fibers themselves expand and fill every gap. It's a self-improving repair. I've never seen a modern product that works quite like that under those conditions. The second technique is one that sounds almost unbelievable until you understand the physics behind it. It's called fathering, and it was used when the damage was too large or too far below the waterline for the carpenter to patch from inside. Here's what they did. The crew would take a spare sail, sometimes a topsail or a studding sail, and cover one side with oakum, tar, and sometimes animal dung or wool. Then they'd pass the sail under the hull of the ship from one side to the other, using ropes run beneath the keel. The idea is that the water pressure pushing against the hull from outside would press the sail and all that caulking material directly against the damaged area. The ocean itself becomes your clamp. The water pressure holds the patch in place, and the flow of water into the breach actually draws the sail tighter against the hull. Captain James Cook used this method in 1770 when the Endeavour struck the Great Barrier Reef. His carpenter fathered a sail over the breach, and they made it to shore for proper repairs. What I love about this is the principle behind it. Instead of fighting the water, they used the water's own force to hold the repair in place. That's the kind of thinking that changes how you approach problems. You stop fighting conditions and start working with them. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now, this third method is the one that really made me appreciate what these carpenters could do under pressure. When a mast cracked or partially broke and they couldn't replace it, they used a technique called scarfing at sea. In a proper shipyard, a scarf joint is a clean, precise connection where two timbers overlap at matching angles and get bolted or bound together. At sea, they didn't have that luxury, but they adapted the principle. If a mast cracked partway through, the carpenter would shape splints from the heaviest spare timber on board, usually oak or whatever tropical hardwood they'd picked up in port. These splints, sometimes called fish pieces, were shaped with an adze and draw knife to follow the round profile of the mast as closely as possible. They'd be placed on opposite sides of the crack, and here's where it gets clever. They were bound in place using wooding. That's a technique where you wind heavy rope around and around the mast, over the splints, soaking the rope in water as you go. As the rope dries, it shrinks and tightens, clamping those splints against the mast with enormous force. Some accounts describe them driving thin wedges under the rope between wraps to increase pressure even further. I tried a version of this in my shop on a cracked beam, using the same principle of shaped splints and shrink-wrapped cordage. It held remarkably well. The key insight is that the splints don't just reinforce the break, they redistribute the bending load across a longer section of the mast, which is sound structural engineering. These men didn't know the math, but they knew what worked. The fourth method addresses a problem that most of us in a heated shop never have to think about: working with wood that is soaking wet and will stay that way. Below the waterline, every piece of wood in the repair is saturated. You can't dry it, you can't wait. And wet wood behaves completely differently than dry wood. It splits easier along the grain. It's harder to get a clean cross-grain cut, and nothing sticks to it the way it sticks to dry wood. The ship's carpenter dealt with this in several ways. First, when they needed to shape a replacement plank or a plug for a hole, they would char the surface of the new wood with a heated iron, or a small fire. This did two things. It dried the outer layer enough to make it workable, and the charred surface actually created a primitive seal that slowed reabsorption of water. I've seen archaeological evidence of repair patches with clear charring marks that confirm this wasn't accidental. Second, when they needed to fasten into wet wood, they used a technique that surprised me. They would heat their iron nails or bolts until they were almost red hot and drive them in while hot. The heat from the fastener would momentarily dry the wood fibers right around the hole, causing them to grip the metal tighter as they cooled and reabsorbed moisture. The nail essentially bakes its own seat into the wet wood. Compare that to driving a cold nail into saturated timber, where the fibers just push aside and never really grab. This is not something I've ever seen in a modern woodworking manual, but the logic is perfect. Now, the fifth method is really about the toolkit itself, because what these carpenters carried and how they improvised when tools broke or wore out tells you everything about their resourcefulness. A ship's carpenter's chest was regulated by the Navy, and inventories from the early 1700s list specific contents. You'd find a caulking mallet, several sizes of caulking irons, a hand adze, a draw knife, an auger for boring holes, a crosscut saw, chisels, a broad axe, and a supply of oakum, tar, lead sheets, and tallow. But here's the reality. On a pirate vessel or a ship that had been at sea for months, tools broke, saw blades snapped, chisels lost their edges, and there was no proper grinding stone. So the carpenter improvised. There are accounts of carpenters making replacement chisel edges by hammering flat iron barrel hoops into rough blades and grinding them on a piece of coral or sandstone. Auger bits were fashioned from large nails heated and twisted in the forge. When the caulking mallet head split, they'd wrap it in rope and keep swinging. The lesson here isn't about these specific improvisations. It's about the mindset. These men never looked at a broken tool and said the job can't be done. They looked at what they had and figured out how to make it work. I try to carry that same thinking into my shop now. Before I order a replacement or a specialty tool, I ask myself, what do I already have that could solve this problem? Let me share some patterns I've noticed in my own work that studying these methods helped me break out of. The first pattern is waiting for perfect conditions. I used to put off repairs or projects until the temperature was right, the humidity was right, everything was ideal. These carpenters didn't have that option. They worked in saltwater spray and tropical heat in freezing Atlantic gales, and their repairs held. That taught me to stop using conditions as an excuse and start working with what I've got. The second pattern is over-relying on modern adhesives. I reached for wood glue or epoxy for everything. But studying how oakum and tar and mechanical fastening held ships together for months in open ocean made me realize I was ignoring an entire category of repair techniques. Sometimes a mechanical fix with wedges, compression, and natural swelling materials is more appropriate than reaching for a bottle of glue, especially in wet or outdoor applications. The third pattern is discarding damaged material. My instinct when a board cracks or a joint fails is to cut out the bad section and replace it with new wood. But the ship's carpenter couldn't do that. He had to work with the damaged piece. He'd reinforce it, splint it, bind it, plug it. And I've started doing more of that in my own work. Not every crack needs to be cut out. Sometimes a well-placed Dutchman or a reinforcing spline is the smarter repair. The fourth pattern is requiring precision for every task. In our modern shops, we aim for gaps you can't see, tolerances measured in thousandths. And that's wonderful for furniture. But for structural repairs, outdoor projects, and rough work, that standard can actually slow you down and keep you from getting a functional result. The pirate carpenter's standard was simple. Does it keep the water out? If yes, move on to the next problem. There's a freedom in that kind of thinking that I've come to appreciate. The good news is, once you recognize these patterns in yourself, you can start choosing when precision matters and when resourcefulness matters more. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is a waterproofing method I found referenced in multiple accounts from the age of sail, and I've adapted it for my own shop with great results. Ship's carpenters would mix melted tallow that's rendered beef or mutton fat with powhite or charcoal dust to create a thick paste. They'd apply this mixture to repair patches, to the seams around deck planking, and to any exposed end grain below the waterline. Here's why it works. The tallow penetrates into the wood fibers and displaces water. The charcoal particles fill the microscopic pores in the wood surface. Together, they create a hydrophobic barrier that actually improves with slight warming, like from sun exposure on a deck. I make a modern version of this by melting beeswax instead of tallow, mixing in activated charcoal powder from the hardware store at a ratio of roughly 4 parts wax to 1 part charcoal by volume, and applying it warm to outdoor project end grain with a stiff brush. I've used this on fence posts, garden bed frames, and the bottom of shop door frames that get wet from rain splash. After 2 years of exposure, the pieces I treated with this mixture are noticeably harder and show almost no checking compared to pieces I left untreated or just hit with a commercial deck sealer. It takes about 15 minutes to mix a batch. It costs almost nothing, and it works. Sometimes the old ways really are better. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 16 chapters of techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what Secrets of the Shipyard is. It is my collection of Viking and naval carpentry secrets from the world's greatest traditional shipwrights, all in one place, with 25 hand-drawn illustrations and 150 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time. I appreciate you spending time with me today. These old sailors had a lot to teach us, and honestly, the more I study how they worked, the more it changes how I think about my own projects. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.